Well, we're not too behind schedule, so let's see if we can get ourselves back on track here. That was an extraordinary session, and I'm looking forward to moderating the next extraordinary session. I want to once again thank everybody for coming. Thank Mayor Dinkins for hosting us today, as he's done over the last almost 15 years on this policy forum. I'm not sure if everybody's aware of the fact this is the 20th anniversary of Mayor Dinkins' election to the mayoralty, the first African-American mayor of the city of New York. He's not here to accept his accolades. He's on his way in. But everybody knows what a transformative and important moment that was in New York City's history. I still like to talk about the gorgeous mosaic because I think he got that right. Our next panel, and before we start, I just want to say thank you once again to the Rockefeller Foundation and SIPA for hosting us today, and also to welcome Lieutenant Governor Basil Patterson, who's here with us. Very much happy to see you and have you, and all of the former commissioners of the Dinkins administration and current commissioners of the City of New York who have joined us for the forum today. And of course, Deputy Mayor Barbara Fife from the Dinkins administration, who's also here with us today. This afternoon's final panel is a reflection on New York City and the economic recovery agenda for the metro region, and really the role Washington has played or has not played in helping us toward this economic recovery. And I have to say, we couldn't have found three more articulate, intelligent, and creative New Yorkers to lead us in this panel today. And it's my pleasure to introduce all three of them and then ask them to step up and share their thinking with us, and hopefully we will have some time for questions at the end of the panel. I would first like to introduce, on my far left, Deputy Mayor Robert Lieber. Robert Lieber is in the probably most critically important role as the city emerges from the current national recession. He is the current Deputy Mayor for Economic Development under Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And he began this position in February of 2007. Actually, he was named president of New York City's Economic Development Corporation then, and I think probably didn't realize that he would soon become deputy mayor of economic development in January 2008. I know that Mayor Bloomberg could not have found a more able and, as I said, more creative person to lead us in this position. He is really responsible for creating jobs and building the economic capacity in the 5 boroughs, the Department of Small Business Services, the city's Economic Development Corporation, the Planning Department, the Department of Finance, and New York City and Company all report to him. It's a new configuration of agencies, all designed to really kickstart and boost and maintain this economic development economic development projects in New York City. He is right now has his hands full, I think, with Willets Point, Lower Manhattan, Hudson Yards, 125th Street, Jamaica, and Coney Island, just to name some of the few projects that he is involved in right now and spearheading. Deputy Mayor Lieber previously served as managing director of Lehman Brothers, where he was global head of real estate investment and banking. Institutional Investor magazine, I love this one, Bob, named him for Deal of the Year and Financier of the Year in 2005. He received his BA from the University of Colorado and an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. It's just another example of New York City attracting the best and the brightest from all over the country. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Second, David Jones, Most of you in this room know David, but I'm going to introduce him anyway because it's really a sincere pleasure to be standing here and introducing David Jones, who has really given his heart, his soul, if not his life, to public service in New York City. And he is really a paramount example for any of my students in the room today. Look at David Jones' career, and if you're lucky, you get to do 1/10 of what he's done. He is currently the president and chief executive officer of the Community Service Society in New York City, a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that promotes the economic advancement and full civic participation for low-income New Yorkers. I love this in his bio. It says he's an outspoken advocate for low-income New Yorkers. I'd say it differently. I'd say he is probably the best advocate the working people in this city could have, speaking truth to power every day, every opportunity that he can, and making the rest of the city, I think, a better place as a consequence of his work. He did serve in government as the commissioner for the Department of Youth. Our current commissioner for the Department of Youth and Community Development is here, Jeannie Mulgrave, and I'm sure that things have changed somewhat since you've been there, but really, I think, set the stage for this is one of the most creative and, I think, progressive of the city agencies now under Mayor Michael Bloomberg. I hope the rest of the commissioners are not here to hear me, but everybody knows that's what I think. And finally, David has also served as chair of the board of Carver Federal Savings Bank, so has been both in the public and private sector. He received his Juris Doctor from Yale, and he has a bachelor's degree from Wesleyan. And we are really also grateful for you being with us today, David, and I'm looking forward to a exciting and feisty conversation here. Finally, last but not least, of course, Kathryn Wylde, President and CEO of the Partnership for New York City. Kathy also doesn't really need much introduction for most people in this room. And she's just had, I think, one of the most extraordinary careers in bridging the differences between the public, private, and nonprofit sector and actually figuring out how to make them all work together. This is not an easy feat for many of you who've tried to do it, and I think most people don't do it effectively. And this is, as I said, something that now is a model, a national model in which other cities come to New York to try and learn from Kathy on how she has run the partnership and really made it a civically engaged, constructive, and creative force for policy in New York. The partnership, as it's described, works with government, labor, and the not-for-profit sectors to build a stronger New York with a focus on education, infrastructure, and the economy. And under Kathy's leadership, it's done all of that and more with far-reaching policy reports, behind-the-scenes negotiations, pulling things basically out of the fire that we thought would collapse. There's Kathy there making sure that people actually work together. I don't know how you do it, Kathy. I really don't. I don't think there's anybody that can do it as effectively as she has. And you know what? She comes from Madison, Wisconsin. So go no. I don't know how that happened. Is that what explains it? I think maybe going to St. Olaf's College, or maybe because you actually live in Brooklyn and not in Manhattan. But Kathy brings her expertise, her energy, and her sheer intelligence, all for the better of this city. And again, these are really three of the pillars of our civil society in New York, and I'm just thrilled they're up here at Columbia helping us celebrate Mayor Dinkins' 20th anniversary, and will be speaking for us on this issue that's, I think, so important to us, how to get our economy going again. and how to essentially recover and continue that recovery through the 21st century. Thank you very much in advance, and I'm going to begin our panel by calling on Deputy Mayor Lieber.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Esther and Mayor Dinkins, for hosting this and having me here today. One of the other things that I am particularly proud of that I have been able to do is I had the opportunity to also serve as an adjunct professor at Columbia several years ago, teaching a real estate capital markets class. So that was really the most fun, and I still find it interesting that almost 15 years ago now, I still run into students of mine who I'll see on the street who are doing different things, and so trying to connect with students and make some kind of an impact, hopefully positive, on what they can do is really very, very fulfilling. And when I started in this job 3 years ago, I had no idea what an interesting trip that was going to be in terms of 2 different cycles and what's happened in our economy. When I started, I retired from Lehman Brothers in 2006. The market was at an all-time high. Everything was going great, and here we are 3 years later. We're certainly in a slightly different position, and I think as we've been with summarize and talk a little bit today about what the stimulus package has done and where it's taken New York City and where we think we are today and where we're going to go as we move forward and some of the critical aspects and critical challenges that we face as we go. But and I think the good news is that I think we're through the worst of this now. I think we have seen kind of the bottom, or we're close to the bottom, and we see things starting to pick up, or at least things on the horizon. One of the things that we look at that we are very troubled, though, is the unemployment rate. Unemployment rate is up over from where it was last year, about 3% higher than it was last year, and even up a little bit from November. Unemployment rate seems to be a lagging indicator. It tends to be, and is calculated in different ways, but it's still a very, very important part of what I think underlies the overall economic recovery in the nation, and certainly here in New York City. And I think even though any job loss is too much, there are some encouraging signs today. We have job losses today that about 140,000 people. That's the bad news. The good news is that that's about 130,000 less than what we really projected at this stage of the game. So while it's been a tumultuous time, we actually have seen less job losses than we expected. And I think also you can look at a couple of different things that have happened, but I think the ERA program, or the stimulus package, as far as the way we track it, and you can see it on stimtracker.gov, but we projected or counted about 27,000, almost 28,000 jobs have been directly created or retained because of the stimulus funding and what's taken place here in New York City. So that's been a very positive contributor, certainly. I think another part for us, given New York City's concentration around the finance business, around the banking, the insurance, securities business and stuff, that the TARP program that was put in place a year ago has also done a lot to support the underlying businesses in the securities industry. Our job losses in the securities sector are about 33,000. Again, too many, more than we want certainly, but certainly less than the 60,000 or so that we had originally forecasted. So, financial services is down, not as bad as we thought it was going to be, but still materially bad. But we do see other sectors that are actually doing better than when we had anticipated. And I think part of this is a lot about planning. I'm certainly going to give my boss a lot of credit for planning. Since I've been here, we've been through 7 different sets of cuts in terms of our budget process to try and bring things in line and anticipate what was coming. But I think when we look at the stimulus package overall, it certainly was a really important shot in the arm for New York City, because in many respects it really gave us time, bought us time, the ability to stabilize things, to widen the safety net and maintain the essential services that are so critical to keeping the city together, and to do this without having to substitute money that we would use for long-term investments in the future. It has provided a great cushion for what we're trying to do. Overall, the stimulus package, we contributed about $5 billion to New York City. $4 billion of this comes in expense money, and then another 900 and some odd million comes in capital money. But of the $4 billion that came in expense dollars to New York City from the stimulus package, the bulk of that, 3.6 out of $4 billion, went to Medicaid relief and to education. So two very important fundamental services for the city were protected, again, largely from the $4 billion in expense dollars. Outside of this $4 billion was another almost $900 million that went directly to food stamp recipients, again, trying to provide that safety net for New Yorkers. And what this money has done is it really helped us build upon some of the innovative anti-poverty programs that we've developed to try and help New Yorkers who are in particular need. Some of it is the helping New Yorkers file their earned income tax credits. There were almost a little over 850,000 EITC returns filed in 2008 alone, which saved $2.3 billion. We've also opened 5 offices of the financial empowerment offices to help low-income New Yorkers build their asset base and learn ways to avoid the predatory lending that was taking place, as well as money for child tax credits. Again, more than 50,000 New Yorkers received more than $30 million in child tax credit claims in the first year alone. And I think that it's important to think about this, though, when you look at the stimulus package overall. You know, it was originally conceptualized, I believe, as an infrastructure bill, trying to build for the long term, for the future. But for us, it was really, it was critical to be able to try and shore up the city's position and the city's budget at a particularly difficult time. As I mentioned, the stimulus money went largely, that $4 billion, to support education and Medicaid costs. So the bulk of the infrastructure money really went not for infrastructure, but for basic essential services here in the city. There was some $900 million that went for the infrastructure here. Again, so it provides us the opportunity to be able to use the money to support essential services, and we still have money that we can use for infrastructure as we go forward. Kathy, I promised that I'd go through some of the numbers here in overall, but we anticipate overall from the stimulus about $5 billion in total, and that breaks down into 8 different categories. $2.1 billion of that is in the education that I mentioned before. Medicaid relief provided another $1.6 billion. The infrastructure dollars that we have available to us were a little over $900 million. Money to help stabilize vulnerable neighborhoods accounted for about $190 million. Public safety, again, one of the most important things we have here in New York, was about $80 million. And then energy efficiency, health and human services, and workforce development made up the balance of that funding here. So I think that, again, it bought us a significant amount of time and gave us the ability to think about moving forward. And I think the challenge for us today is to make sure that New York City and the country can continue to retain our position for long-term competitiveness and for growth. So when we think about New York City's competitiveness and we think about infrastructure, we think about what are the things that we can do today that are going to make the biggest impact as we go forward. So in this mayor's administration, a lot of focus has been on long-term capital programs, long-term infrastructure programs, the extension of the number 7 train that the New York City is paying for exclusively here, not the MTA, of over $2 billion to build that additional capacity in the west side on the Hudson Yards, continuing the work to try and accelerate the completion of the 3rd water tunnel. Again, big, important, long-term capital projects that are going to see the fruits of these investments, not over the next 2 to 3 years, but over the next 2 to 3 to 4 decades as New York City continues to grow. Capital commitments for fiscal year 10, we're continuing. Our capital budget for 2010 was over $11 billion, which is a 65% increase over it was when Mayor Bloomberg came into office here. So again, making those investments today, they're going to have the ability to pay dividends as we go forward. I mentioned there's $900 million that comes from the stimulus package for infrastructure. We've already contracted for over $500 million of that. A lot of that is going for transportation projects, reconstruction of the Brooklyn Bridge on-ramps, work at the ferry terminal in Staten Island. We're also over $200 million is going to the water supply and wastewater treatment plants, and then over $400 million, again, into public housing. We also have applied and have been able to take advantage of other aspects that come out of the stimulus package, including the recovery zone bond program. And this is a program that was distributed by the federal government and by formula, and we were allocated a little over $120 million. And the Economic Development Corporation, or EDC, is responsible for applying this $120 million in different loans. And what we did is we set up an RFP process where people could actually apply for using this money. And the criteria that we used around infrastructure was looking at the projects, trying to make a determination of how quickly that money could be put to productive use, how quickly, the shovel readiness aspect of this. These allocations were made in economically distressed areas, and then also based on their overall financial feasibility. So in the first round, we had over $35 million allocated to projects in Brooklyn and Queens. The second round, almost $70 million is in process for 4 projects, including the Cultural and Art Center in Central Harlem, an 80,000 square foot state-of-the-art medical office building to be in the North Queens Medical Center, an expanded parking structure for the St. Barnabas Hospital in the Bronx. Again, looking at ways that we can put this money to work right away to create jobs and to build infrastructure that will give us the capacity as we move forward in the future. So I think when we look at the $900 million that's come in infrastructure, and we think about these initial projects, the one thing that I think we need to continue to think about as far as New York City's own competitiveness is we need to think on a slightly more regional basis here. I mean, we tend to be very myopically focused on the 5 boroughs or in our own little areas here, but we need to think more about New York City's competitiveness here and necessary improvements at the airports. Just the FAA, the tracking system that we use is an antiquated system that's over 40 years old. The technology in the airplanes far exceeds the technology that's on the ground to control them, which is kind of scary. But we also need to continue to think about mass transit infrastructure improvements and looking at different ways that we're going to be able to accommodate the growth in our population and reduce the overall dependence on the automobile. So very important things as we continue to think about the long-term perspective of New York City. We're also using $80 million, targeting it to different kinds of energy efficiency programs that we've got, retrofitting city buildings. We've made a commitment to reduce the carbon footprint in city buildings. And we're also creating a revolving loan fund for the Greater Greener Building Plan, which is another way to encourage landlords and tenants to make the improvements necessary to improve the efficiency of the space that they occupy. Another critical part for New York City and its long-term competitiveness is our affordable housing. Back in 2005, the mayor announced the affordable housing program designed to renovate or build 165,000 new units. Just looking at the market today and what's going on out there, and last week, 2 weeks ago in the State of the City, the mayor announced a $750 million fund that is going to be targeted in terms of trying to buy and to rehabilitate distressed multifamily properties and look at ways that we can convert these properties into affordable housing. I mean, you can see it all around projects that are partway through or not completed or completed and then haven't been tenanted. One of the things that we really worry about, or even existing buildings that took advantage of this financing bubble, over-levered, they don't have the money available to keep the buildings up to code. So we're very concerned about the destabilizing effect of some of these buildings on the neighborhoods and some of the opportunities that we can bring to bear to continue to create more affordable housing out of some of the existing supply and to continue to look for ways to stabilize the neighborhood. So the housing is going to continue to be a very, very important part of all that we do going forward, and it's a particularly big challenge as we look at the market today. One of the other things, Esther, that you talked about, my job on its most simple basis is to create jobs and expand the tax base. So we've talked a lot about the big real estate projects that are out there, whether it be Hudson Yards or Willets Point or Coney Island or Lower Manhattan or 125th Street. A big part of that is kind of building the capacity or building the supply so that we can accommodate people as the city grows. We are also intensely focused right now on creating the demand economics is supply and demand. What we're trying to do now is create more demand and create more jobs, find ways to get people working so that we can occupy as much of the space as we can. And when we look at New York's kind of competitive position overall, what makes this such a great city today, what's going to make it a great city as we continue to move forward, it's clear that talent is our greatest asset. And in order for us to really excel going forward, we need to continue to invest in our people. And looking back in our Workforce One centers last year, we were actually able to place more than 25,000 people who were looking for work last year. That was up, almost 30% from where we were the prior year. So despite the downturn, we were able to increase those placements dramatically. And one of the things that we're doing with stimulus money is taking advantage of the Workforce One centers and the abilities that we had through our small business services to trying to create sector-specific initiatives, training programs that address the needs of the businesses in the community and the people who live there. So whether it be in the healthcare center that we've announced with LaGuardia Community College, which we project 750 placements or so over the first 2 years, looking for ways for patient care technicians, EMTs, paramedics, LPNs, et cetera. These are, good paying jobs, and this is money that is very targeted for specific uses, also comes from some of the money that we were able to get from the stimulus package. We also announced a manufacturing sector center looking for targeted manufacturing industrial jobs, particularly in Brooklyn, looking at different parts of the waterfront and where we see technology and manufacturing coming together to create jobs in Brooklyn as well. So we're trying to find different ways to address the specific needs of the businesses and the communities and the people who live there, and using stimulus money to create these training programs. Small businesses, employ more than 50% of the New Yorkers actually work for small businesses here. And what we've seen over the last 2 years is even those small businesses that had really the best relationships with their banks, that had great credit records, et cetera, found that the banks that they had these relationships were unwilling to continue to fund them as they went forward here. So EDC started what we call the Capital Access Loan Program back about a year ago, and we're providing loans and working with the local banks to provide loans between $5,000 and $250,000 in terms of the loan amounts to these small businesses, so that these businesses have the money necessary to pay their employees, to pay to keep the utilities, the lights and the doors open here, so that people can continue to be employed as we move forward here. We've started a number of other businesses and training centers with the helps of the Kaufman Foundation to support entrepreneurship, working with the Levin Institute to train professionals into other industries and get jobs that they can apply their skills. I've created business incubator spaces from landlords that have surplus space in their buildings today, take advantage of the market for office space that's a little soft right now, and working with great landlords who will use that space and dedicate it to people who are starting their businesses and want the opportunity to get up and get running here. So looking at different industries, whether it be the fashion industry, whether it be in the technology business and the media business, and the healthcare business, all important sectors for us in New York City, and we want to make sure people have the requisite skills and the training and match them up with jobs so we can get people back to work. So I think when at the topic of how has the stimulus money affected New York City, I think that it really came at a very important time for us, which a very much needed shot in the arm that made sure that the city stayed in its position to be able to provide the critical safety net to the residents who are here. But as we continue to work our way through these tough times, I think it's important that we continue to think about the city's competitive position, and we need to continue to focus on making the infrastructure investments that can, both locally and regionally, that can keep the city in as competitive position as we can. And we want to continue to look for ways that we can match up the needs of industries and the employees who are out there looking for work, and look for different ways that we can do this in different kinds of economic sectors, not just in financial services. So that's kind of an overview of the numbers and the math in terms of how the stimulus money has been applied. I think we've been through tough times. I hope that we'll start to see some pickup in the employment rates or decline in the unemployment rates here probably the second half of 2010, and we'll see as we move forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I'd like to call on David Jones.
Well, I have to give credit to David Dinkins, certainly one of my mentors over the years, and Basil. These are the guys you went to as part of your transition if you thought about public service, and they both were extraordinarily helpful. And many in this room I know and have worked with on a variety of things, and Esther has been a friend, and Kathy has been a friend for years. I think there was a comedy show on Monty Python now for something completely different, and I'm sort of talking about that, another part of New York that has some significant problems in this recession that I think are going to be with us even as the recovery gets underway. And I think it has implication, obviously, for the individuals who are caught in this problem, as well as for the rest of the city, because I think this is going to be a millstone on the city unless addressed rather quickly and aggressively. And I'll talk what that's about. Before the recession, New York City was in pretty poor shape in terms of a number of factors, particularly income inequality. I think many people have talked about this. We have a dumbbell shaped of a lot of low-wage workers and some people making extraordinary money at the top, and very sort of an eroding middle class. So this was the shape before this recession hit. And basically, we're going to need a great deal of investment to work particularly with low-wage workers, and there are a lot of them. Nearly a third of New Yorkers fall into that category. They are earning very low income. They're primarily non-unionized workers. And this recession actually is their recession. There's some analysis that there is no recession for the college-educated in the city of New York or in the rest of the nation. This is a recession primarily of people without, that's probably my daughter, and I'll turn this off. So she's away, so we keep track. But this is primarily a recession of those with limited educational skills. And if you start to tilt those numbers, reflecting that, the 10.6% we're talking about immediately starts to double when it comes to black workers particularly without high school. The same for Latino workers in that respect. And those are the workers that are most at risk in this recession. And as you see the 10.6 numbers, what the other number you have to reflect on in terms of when the recovery actually will hit low-wage workers is the sharp reduction in hours and wages. Because as the slow recovery moves its way through the society, the employers are not going to start hiring. They're going to start bringing back hours and increasing wages for their existing workforce before they begin to get into the unemployed and structurally unemployed as they go forward. Let me tell you why we're concerned about this. Many of you know that we've been writing for a long time, pre-recession, about critical problems, particularly among single and married black males in New York City. Talking about the fact that nearly 50% are not currently in the workforce, that this is not a matter of the unemployment rate, this is the matter of people who are still actively looking for work. And when you get to people who have given up in one way or the other, the numbers skyrocket, particularly for black men. But we've also recently come up with other problems that we're going to have to address as we want to get out of this recession. We recently issued a report on something called GED, a program that was actually set up for returning veterans after World War II who didn't want to go back to high school and didn't want to sit in a classroom at the little desks after they fought for American freedom. That program that was for GIs has morphed into a critical program to deal with credentialing of workers in New York City. We now have about 1.1 million New Yorkers who don't have a high school diploma. We have one of the worst GED passage rates in the nation. We also, I regret to say, have one of the worst outcomes for our community college system. There are a whole range of issues that we're relying on here, and we have to be honest about some of the disinvestment and failure to act particularly focusing on low-wage workers and people who are not necessarily on academic tracks, but who need, in a globalized economy, the kinds of skills that at least will get them into the door so they can feed themselves and their families. And I think we can't be proud of how New York is done on all. We did a study some time ago, and many of you know about, on career and technical education. Again, New York, that's voc ed. Again, last in the nation. We seem to hit it. Not that we're not a great city, not that we don't have incredible institutions like Columbia and NYU and the rest, but we've always given short shrift to essentially programs for non-academics. Oh, it doesn't matter, they'll get some kind of low-wage work. Oh, it doesn't matter, we'll push them or they can drop out of school. It doesn't matter if they don't come back and get their GED. There'll always be unskilled work. Well, we're now in an economy where clearly what's happening as this recession churns on, there is no low-wage work. That people are clamoring. The joke is, not so joke, that now Starbucks is looking for people with some years of college. Why? Because they can get these people. Who needs a youngster who has a 6th grade reading level, who was pushed out or dropped out, when I can get somebody with 2 or 3 years of college who's clamoring for what used to be a low-wage job? So I put this out not to say or point a finger that we're, this is, terrible, what we can do, we have to wring our hands, there's nothing to be done about it. But at least we have to reflect that as we talk about infrastructure, let's be honest that the construction trades in the city of New York have never hired blacks and Latinos in significant numbers. Let's be honest about that. You hear that, there was $453 million in stimulus money that went to NYCHA. Most of it did not go to residents of NYCHA. We again, even though we have laws that are promulgated out of HUD called Section 3, we haven't traditionally spent a lot of effort making sure that the tenants in public housing got jobs or job training. That's changing, but we have to look at what's going to really impact, not the top end now. Now we have to focus on this city starts to wobble. If you have so many people who are out of work, who your unemployment rates remain at the numbers that we hit in the Great Depression, which is about 25%, for many communities, for Black and Latino communities, they're there. But I don't see WPA programs springing up because everyone says the recession is over. That's all we need in stimulus. And infrastructure projects are always not having any requirement, particularly to hire people at the bottom, even if it's a construction project that's right in their community. So these are some of the things we have to go on to. But let me talk about the positives, and there are positives out there. And that's what I think is more important and where I think we should start attacking this thing that broadens on many of the things that the deputy mayor says, but are consistent. One of the things is we have to recognize that transitional jobs and WPA program kinds of models have to be had in the city of New York to stabilize this thing. We have about 30,000 people who are unemployed, 16 to 24, just in public housing. I don't think this is a good idea to have that large number of people without skills and credential sitting around staring out into space long term. Because we know that one of the dangers here is our 10.6% unemployment. People will begin to give up. Everyone knows this. If you're out of work for 2 weeks, that's one thing. If you're out of work for a year, that's quite another thing. And as people become further and further divorced from the labor market, the ability to reattach them becomes that much more difficult. So the necessity has to be, even though I know it's, this is too much money, too much this and that, we have to think of techniques of giving jobs of last resort. I'm not talking about great jobs necessarily, to this large body, particularly the young and the not so young, and we'll talk about that, who are losing hope too quickly. I think it's dangerous to the city, it's dangerous to the civic life of this city if that number continues to grow and embitter a whole generation of young people. I think we have to do something. There are some things you can do, and they've already been discussed. Congressman Rangel got a piece in the stimulus that is just working its way through regulation of a tax credit to help private employers. This is, Kathy and I both worked on this, that would essentially give a large tax credit to young people who have been out of work for 6 months, out of school for 6 months, just to incentivize private business to start hiring that group. On the infrastructure side, we worked with Congressman Nadler, who's put in a bill that would be matched and linked up with the transportation infrastructure, but it could be worked on any infrastructure that creates model WPA programs where teams of young people work together on essentially infrastructure projects in their thousands. I think these are projects that can be worked out. Jerry worked with National Labor on this to make sure it passed muster, but I think we have to innovate now and not just think we got that infrastructure dollars, that's it. We have to recognize that ordinarily that infrastructure money won't provide jobs to the individuals who need it most, and we have to start working on that and engaging that. Similarly, we spend over $1 billion on public housing in the city of New York. There's something called Section 3 that I drive people crazy on. I've been doing it for a while, which mandates that the first hires of federal money of this sort is supposed to go to the people who are the residents of public housing or the surrounding area. This has been abysmal. This is Democrat, Republican, no one has enforced this. To his credit, our Sean Donovan from the city and Assistant Secretary Tresvinas has committed to enforcing Section 3 regulations. What that could mean, if it was seriously enforced, would be thousands of potential jobs for particularly young people and not so young people in public housing. This is not going to solve the recession. I just want to give some glimmers of hope for people so they hold on while we wait around for this recession and its unemployment rate to abate. All of these projects obviously require political will. And that's one of the problems we're having in Washington, and obviously everyone sees it. New York City can only do so much. But New York City has to use its position because New York City is not alone in this. We did a report some years ago by Mark Levitan, who's now with the city government, which showed that we have about 200,000 people, 16 to 24, who were not in school and not in work. It was the highest number I'd ever seen of that number. These are 16 to 24-year-olds who never connected. Why? We can talk about, but I don't think it's relevant. It turns out that there were 5 million across the nation, not only in urban areas, but in suburban areas, basically without high school credentialing, who just couldn't get a toehold in the economy. I think we're going to have to look at the disconnected youth because we have the highest number of anywhere in the country, but we have ways to link hands with other major cities. They're having the same problem, whether that's Detroit or Newark or LA. Each of them is going to be facing, after this recession begins to abate, large numbers of young people particularly who are completely left behind and don't have a reason to hang in there. I think we have to make common cause with those, but we have to be realistic and talk seriously to the construction trades and others that we're going to have to allow certain numbers of people a chance to get in at the bottom in apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship programs if we're going to hold this thing still. We're not talking about taking unionized jobs. We're talking about actively working with the union movement, and I think it will take leadership from the mayor, from the governor, and from the president to get that done. Similarly, we can't look at summer jobs as quite the way they are. Summer jobs are no longer just a frill to keep people off the streets. We desperately need that. This summer, I dread. We have to make sure not only that summer jobs are maintained, and they've been cut in the first proposals coming out of Albany, but we have to make sure they're augmented, because I can't go through Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights and Brownsville and the South Bronx with this kind of unemployment rate with no hope for young people going forward. Simple things to do right away, and I talk about the educational programs. We have to make GED. This is ridiculous. I don't know why we're below Mississippi in GED. We spend about $60 million in the state. We have awful outcomes. We have awful outcomes not only in city programs, but in CUNY programs, though they do much better than everywhere. and we have HRA programs that are not working. We just have to take this seriously. This is blocking and tackling. This isn't new money. This is competence, which this administration does particularly well. And I think we just have to have the kind of focus to make sure no one who touches the city, whether they are receiving food stamps or going through a job center or going into any contact, doesn't come out with at least a credential, because they can't compete going in this society without that basic credential. I think those are the kinds of things I want to see. I think what I'm concerned about is, as I hear the talk of recovery, it is again becoming too narrowly focused. It is not recognizing the nature of this recession and who's gotten hurt worst and who really endangers the fabric of New York. Once we get to that, I think we can all celebrate. This stimulus package was vitally necessary to hold us from total disaster. But as now we look at it, we have to recognize, we have to shift focus now away from Wall Street and the banks to infrastructure, yes, but only as it impacts not only making the city better and work better, but also start bringing into the tent large number of disaffected and alienated and outsiders who are losing ground like crazy and who are not participating in the recovery and who may be permanently unemployed if we don't move now. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm now going to ask Kathy Wylde to close with the final presentation.
Thank you, Esther. And Esther came to work with us at the partnership at the beginning of January, and as our first project, I'm up here working for Esther. That will come as a surprise to few of you.
That's right.
And I also just want to thank Mayor Dinkins for all the support he's given all of us. And I was reminded as I'm sitting there, and often am reminded, thinking about the challenges that we face in our city and our country. One of the first things Mayor Dinkins was asked to do after his historic election as the first African-American mayor of New York City was to lead a delegation shortly after Nelson Mandela was released from prison. He led a delegation of about 30 of us, and Nadine and Heck and Arnie Segar, and some of us are here that were on that trip and it was amazing because Mayor Dinkins went through in these caravans through the townships of South Africa, and thousands of people came out, and in the background were those yellow trucks with the machine guns peeking out of them that were still there at that time. I mean, it was just an amazing experience, and when we think we face challenges here, I think we can all take heart from the leadership that we're lucky enough to have and what has been accomplished. So I'm pleased to be here on the celebration of your anniversary, Mayor. I'm just going to make you'll be relieved to know, I'm just going to make a few points about the stimulus and the economic situation in which we find ourselves. Tom Swazi mentioned earlier the fact that on average public sector jobs are about 10% of the economy of our cities and states, and that the fact that the stimulus went overwhelmingly to support and retain public sector jobs in education, in healthcare, some in infrastructure, social services, was in fact important not only for closing the budget gaps of the city and state, for stabilizing our economy. One thing I want to point out in terms of the particular challenges in New York, north of Rockland County, it's not 10% of the jobs. The public sector is 20% of the jobs. And that's why our taxes are so high in New York City and Long Island. So the challenge here was, number one, I mean, the good news and the bad news is the stimulus was more important to New York State than to any place, and we got something like $20 billion, and that really saved our state budget last year. But at the same time, it reflects a structural problem we'll have going forward, where if we don't turn from simply filling the gaps in our public sector economy to growing our private sector economy, we are in deep trouble. This year, we only have $4.5 billion left from that $20 billion to apply to this year's deficit, which is, and so we still have a hole on top of that of $7.4 billion in the New York State budget. So we have huge issues facing us that are a big challenge, and we're going to continue to need federal support. That's why the continuation of the kind of assistance we got for education and Medicaid through the federal government, through some of those formulas adjusted to reflect the realities of our needs, are very important going forward. We can't just say the stimulus is over and let's move on. The other thing about this stimulus was that I think, in the gap that everybody's struggling with is we've put out all this money and yet our unemployment rate is high. Our economy, at the fourth quarter of the year, our GDP was up to 5.7%. The news has just come out, and it feels like, that sounds like, wow. The GDP increase was largely a reflection of productivity. The fact that business had laid off many hundreds of millions of people, and they were able to do more with less. And that's our economic gain. So this is the gap between the numbers about the economy and how good it appears things are doing, and the reality of this continuing, growing, chronic now gap in terms of translating that into jobs. Another example, $90 billion of the stimulus funding went into the Department of Energy for grants in renewable energy and to create leadership in this area, and we're all supportive of that. On average, when a new industry is started up, whether it's biotech or high tech, it takes 15 years before that translates into net new jobs and revenues. And we're just starting in the renewable energy field. Maybe we're 3 or 4 years into it. We've got a long ways to go before we're going to feel that coming back into our economy, and that is a real challenge. In New York City, again, as Bob gave a number of the statistics in terms of the economy, 30% of the payroll in New York City comes out of the financial services industry. It's only 12% of the jobs, but 30% of all the payroll dollars, which is, I think, 3 times greater than any other sector. It's a huge piece of our economy, and there is no great world city in the 21st century global economy that is not a financial center. We cannot afford to lose that. For those who think, who are worried about what we spent on the TARP program, in fact, the taxpayers are getting a very handsome return on their TARP investments. Where we're losing boatloads is on the car companies. And even though all the legislation coming out of Washington says let Main Street pay for Wall Street, fiscal responsibility, repayment fees, in fact, the banking industry is going to handsomely repay the taxpayer with interest. And it is not something that we should feel is a bailout that's a bottomless pit. We are, in fact, demonstrating the resilience of our industry. So the last person standing to defend the banking industry, here I am. What is our challenge going forward? It is uncertainty, lack of clear vision. The American consumer, the president is in his budget plan, and his economic plan is getting incentives to the middle-class taxpayer. Well, that's okay, but it's not going to turn our economy around quickly because the middle-class taxpayer is about as insecure as you can get. Major corporations are about as insecure as you can get. They are not feeling comfortable about what's going to happen in the economy because we are shell-shocked by what's happened in the last 2 years that nobody expected to happen, number one. Number two, we're not sure how we're going to deal with the competitive pressures. The American economy is not a source of growth in terms of its future contribution. It's the emerging economies from Asia and Africa and around the world that are the source of future growth, and we have to figure out how to service those economies. The president, in his address, also said the goal is to double exports in the next 5 years. Absolutely critical because we're not going to grow the economy domestically. We are going to have to grow through international exports, and that is obviously heavily comes down on services. And the question is, what are they? What are we going to do? And there's no clear plan. We don't have an economic development corporation or a deputy mayor for economic development at the federal level. We don't have a clear plan for how we're going to integrate the expenditures in energy and in education and in all these areas and flow them back into a strategic plan for building the American economy, for competing overseas. Other countries do, and they pay attention certainly to their great business cities and capitals. They invest in it, they think about it. Some would say they overplan. But I think that one thing we have to do is think in terms of the next iteration. What comes after stimulus? What comes after bailout? It is a strategic plan for going forward on a variety of fronts, some of which David mentioned, and some of which Bob mentioned in terms of our economy. So I guess those are my thoughts. Trying to see if I have anything else. I think that'll do it. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. That was just extremely provocative and creative, and I'm hoping we have some questions from the group here. If you want, please stand up at the mic. We have a little while for questions.
Hi. It's hard to connect the Deputy Mayor's remarks with David, but I'm going to try because you talked about small businesses.
Could you identify yourself? Thank you. Or I will.
I'm Nancy Waxstein. I'm the Executive Director of United Neighborhood Houses and a former member of the Dinkins administration. You talked about small businesses. In fact, we know that I think the mayor said that nonprofit businesses employ 1/7 of New York City's people. But yet when we talk about supporting small businesses, very often nonprofits are left out of that equation, and they have the same problems of access to credit and the same problems of health insurance, soaring health insurance costs. So I'm wondering what you see as the role of the city in supporting nonprofits, and to connect it to David's remarks, we in the nonprofit community are the ones who are most likely to employ entry-level people, low-skilled people, give them their first step on the employment ladder, give them a chance, maybe starting in after-school programs or wherever, to get into the workforce. So I would say that we have a role in addressing both of those problems, but yet I haven't seen the same recognition of the importance of the nonprofit sector in the city's planning.
Okay, I'm going to just ask you to answer that question, then I'm going to take two at a time.
Okay, one of the things that we saw for small businesses that is similar to the not-for-profits, again, is the lack of financing. The banks just drawing in any of the funding that they were going to provide. One of our programs, I talked about it in the context of the small businesses, but we also were working with not-for-profits and with the banks as well. So our capital access program was really designed to work with banks and say, we'll absorb a first percentage of the risk associated with making these kinds of loans, and that would apply to a business or a not-for-profit. So we're not trying to choose or make that selection, because the not-for-profits play an incredibly important role in the economy overall. I think to David's point on the workforce training and the most necessary component of the economy is one of the things that we are working very hard on at Workforce One training is taking people who are unemployed or underemployed and trying to provide the necessary skills and retraining so that they'll be able to come out with a degree. I think the degree program, the vocational, I think those are all very, very important parts of trying to build out the middle class part of the economy here. And that's why we were actually pretty happy to see the success we had, increasing by over 30% the number of people we were actually able to place out of Workforce One centers. In one hand, it was 25,000 versus 17,000 the year before. On the one hand, it's 25,000. We've got a lot more that we're trying to do, and that's what we're trying to model with the successes we've had, particularly around these sector initiatives to try and target those opportunities with the people who need those jobs.
Do you want to comment, David?
Yeah, on the same vein, I mean, one of the things we failed at in terms of the tax credit that Kathy and I worked on with Congressman Rangel was a transferable tax credit. And this idea has been around for 20 years. Actually, Ford Foundation did some of the initial work It ultimately failed because the Internal Revenue Service said that was not the congressional intent. Essentially, a cash credit would work the same as a housing tax credit is, that you could essentially allow a transferable tax credit involving a not-for-profit that could then sell those tax credits to PepsiCo or Coca-Cola or a corporation who needed a tax credit. It runs into severe issues. I think, however, that because of the depth of this recession and because of the lack of real opportunities to get the job motor going, that we're starting to think again that it may be time to revisit this with Ways and Means. If you're not going to come up with stimulus 2 and 3, whether you can come up with novel ideas using the tax code, partially because we have the head of the Ways and Means. But I think we have to be a little more innovative here in coming up with ideas of how not-for-profits could participate in some of the stimulus efforts.
Kathy, who also managed not-for-profits.
I was just going to say, and this may be more provocative than necessary, but the city makes an enormous investment through our property tax laws in not-for-profits. But it's in not-for-profits that are real estate intensive as opposed to service intensive. And I think that's something that you have to stand back and think about.
Thank you. I'm going to ask two.
That's why I said
we didn't hear
And
it.
we're going to protect her.
I'm going to take two questioners at a time. Please be succinct, and then we're going to ask the panel to respond. This way we can get to everybody.
My question has to do, related to David Jones. First of all, thank you for being the steward for the voiceless out there, those in most in need. I think you're familiar with Youth Bill USA,
Sure.
And I understand that in Obama's proposed budget, it's at 120 million, up from 114.
Right.
What's your take on that model for young men and women between the ages of 18 and 24 who fit exactly the profile you're talking about?
Okay, we're going to hold it. One more question.
I'll obey.
I'm an alumnus of Columbia College class of 1959. In my 50 years of observing society, I've come to the conclusion we seem to be going around in circles because in order to function in the 21st century, every individual must have computer skills. And I would think that a massive education program to teach everyone who is out of a job to learn how to use a computer would be quite beneficial to society.
Thank you.
What do you folks think?
Okay, let's do one more.
Hi, my name is Milagros Lecuona. Thank you very much for a wonderful panel. I am a student, dual degree master's here in Columbia. I am actually a student from Major Dinkins. And my question is on the tax credits, how are you going to prevent that employers that are struggling will not let people go in order to hire those employees that will provide them with the tax credits?
You get
Thank
right
you.
to the core of the problem.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Those were all very good questions. Why don't we start, David, Kathy, and then
let me take the
Deputy
last question. I'll try to do very simply. Essentially, what the Internal Revenue Service is slowing this whole process down for is the question of employers gaming the system. It is a danger that has to be highly regulated in order to work. But it also has to be done in a way that can get it to smaller employers. Essentially, the people who make use of tax credits, the best, for instance, PepsiCo is the largest user of tax credits that I know about. It generally, when it drills down to smaller employers, the paperwork burden is much too high for them to make use of it. And we have to figure intermediaries out who can both police this thing to make sure we're not having a game system that basically bumps employees out and then puts lower cost employees in, at the same time making it transparent, easy to use. So that's one thing. Let me talk about Youth Build. We are in discussion with Youth Build, actually, about can the Youth Build model be brought to scale? I drive people crazy. When I was Youth Service Commissioner or Executive Director, whatever we called it at the time, we had so many, I think we still have so many models of programs that work. The problem that drives me crazy, they're never scaled. When you have this many unemployed, 10.6% unemployment, it means that a program that serves 200 or 300 people is not sufficient. For a full employment economy, it's a great program. For an economy in the midst of this employment meltdown, we only can start to talk about programs that impact thousands. And that's why the question, can you come to the city and make marriages of not-for-profits and for-profits and a government that deal with mass-based programs? We've done this before in the past. The gentleman before was talking about we're coming full circle. Teams of people working on critical projects, actually, we have examples in the city of that. But I think the youth build model, we're certainly having discussions with NYCHA and others that we can't expect certain parts of government to know how to do youth development. We have to marry not-for-profits and organizations that actually do this kind of work and can scale it. And can scale it not over years, but can scale it within a reasonable time to give hope.
Well, I think tax credits are hard. But I don't know if there was an op-ed last week in the Sunday Times that Chuck Schumer and Orrin Hatch co-signed on a proposal that I think makes sense, which is a rebate to employers at the end of the year of net new payroll taxes added for new hires on jobs. And that's a lot easier to monitor and I think makes a lot more sense. And that's similar to what Governor Patterson has introduced in his Excelsior program, the economic development, where it is after the fact, the job is created, it's net new jobs, and the credit is directly related to the value, the quality of the job provided.
I guess two things. One is on the tax credits. I think it's all in the execution, and I think that David makes the point, and Kathy reinforces that you have to be careful for what you really do, and having the enforcement and getting the right kind of behavior that comes out of it is what is critical. I think on the computer skills thing, I couldn't agree with you more. It's like basic 101, and that's one of the things that we also, not to bang the drum again, but on the Workforce One training centers, that we provide the training and we also provide the facilities for people who don't have their own computers, who need to be able to access that, get on the internet or be able to use those. Just basic technology is a critical factor to anyone moving forward today.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Perfect.
Hi, I met you all in the elevator. My name is Gwyneth Breeze, and I'm a Master's of International Affairs student here with a focus in urban policy. I wanted to share with you that it seems to me, being a graduate student, that the credentials that you need to be competitive in today's labor market are getting more and more expensive. And frankly, I'm not completely convinced that apprenticeship programs and GED programs are going to be sufficient to prepare people to access a decent living. How would you respond to that concern?
Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Gerard Bouchel, and I am in the financial services industry. One of the questions that I have is there is an explicit tension that seems to continue to manifest when we talk about where are the opportunities. And what I'd like for you to address is the first, how do we structure or at least facilitate having a flexible economy that will facilitate the efficient allocation of capital? Because first and foremost, you don't have to do business in New York City. Okay, that's number one. And then simultaneously resolve the other issue of the tension, the social tension that is very explicit. How do you find or move capital and opportunities to those communities that are impaired in terms of being effectively marginalized out? Because that is always the question. So when we talk about New York City, yes, it is an outlier in terms of inequality. That's a very simple proposition, but there is a multiplier effect that does feed, all right, through the economy. So then the question is, when you talk about the construction trades, as an example, there are jobs that clearly people of color are not getting access to. So when we talk about creating particular types of local programs, not certain that's always the answer, given the fact that historically they've been excluded. So then the question is, how do you resolve this issue of making an economy flexible, but also ensuring that social needs are met in a very fair and open way to really bring people here to do business?
Thank you. Why don't we start first with Deputy Mayor Lieber and work our way back?
Thanks, Esther. How do I want to respond to that? I guess what I would say first of all is that, on the education question, I think that skills and increased levels of skill are going to be critical to anyone's ability to succeed in this world. It's also going to require lots of hard work. I think that's kind of fundamental to everything. And I think the minimum kind of level of education, when David talks about, would you say 1.1 million people don't have GEDs, don't have a GED, I mean, that really is that's really brutal. And you think about a college education now, by and large, is kind of being the base level of training for people as they move forward. To have that high level of people don't even have a high education is a real problem, and I think he identifies that issue. So I think, keep going to school, do well, but get out, you have to work and make some money too as you do it. On the second part, on the creating the opportunities, I think part of what we're trying to do is, New York is not necessarily going to be the lowest cost place for people to do business. You say you don't have to do business in New York City, that's true. People who do business in New York City do it in New York City because they want to do it. I think our competitive advantage is the talent and the people that we do have in New York City by and large. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to be a convener, to try and keep people here in the city and find opportunities for them to match needs and to match opportunities as we go. One of the other things, though, and to David's point earlier about the MWBE hiring and how poor the union's take-up has been on this, one of the things that we've done that hasn't really gotten a lot of fanfare is renegotiated a contract with the unions and a project labor agreement for city projects, city capital funded projects here. And we have the biggest issue that we had in wrestling with the unions, or the most important issue for us, was trying to improve this take-up in MWBE hiring. So before it was something like 1 in 8 that got hired out of a union hall. We have changed those numbers dramatically. So there's I can't recite the exact formula, but that a multiple 3 or 4 times as many people will have this opportunity to get picked up, and it's a requirement here that as the unions pick people or contractors pick people to do the work, that they're picking from an MWE pool as well, that will hopefully see a significant take-up in what has been an otherwise relatively dismal performance by the unions to hire people and give them jobs as they come out of it. So another important part of what we're trying to do.
Kathy?
Did you want to go first?
No, I'm taking the college thing, which I don't want anyone to think that I don't agree with. The trouble is I'm in sort of an emergency. I think before we started doing our in-depth research on this 1,000,001, on black male unemployment, on disconnected youth, I had an inflated notion of the educational levels that we were dealing with. However, we have really a huge educational deficit that we're up against. I think in the mayor's construction opportunity panel that I served on, with Congressman Rangel, that the mayor put together, one of the real difficulties, we had started this effort really to deal with disconnected youth. It soon became apparent that for most pre-apprenticeship programs in the city of New York for the trades requires a high school diploma. But the people coming forward were often reading at a 6th to 8th grade level, and numerously even less. And this is no joke. This means I don't have a quick fix to bring people back on, line. But I think we have to start working on it, and that's what gets me so agitated, that we haven't looked at the resources around GED and other efforts to try to take the first step. Once people can get stabilized and have that first credential, and we find that in the CUNY programs particularly. CUNY gives a GED just as that's part of the course. You get a GED on your way to an associate's degree. Their passage rate on GED goes through the roof because of it. We also find that we can get incredible GED passage rates of people incarcerated. They have one of the highest passage rates because they are very focused. But I just think the contact points have to be serious. This has to be first up, not jobs first, as we still have the idea that everyone had to be forced to work because they were sitting on their rear ends and not working. I think we have to do an analysis which gets people who are seeking support and immediately does a serious assessment of their educational attainment. And yes, you get them working, but you also immediately start working on their skills, because that's the only way you can start to reduce the burden on government. And that's what I'm talking about. This is not the end. And basically we know that once people achieve a GED, once people achieve an associate's degree, then they take off like a big-ass bird. They don't need any of us to help them along. They know what they want. So.
Kathy?
I just say quickly on the question of the economy, I think every generation has to see this for themselves, but for those of us that have been through a couple generations, Mayor Koch and Mayor Dinkins led a economic renaissance in the neighborhoods of our city between 1975 and 1995. The investment, the change, the hope, the quality of housing and infrastructure in the communities of this city it just changed in the most dramatic way, demonstrating that where there is the political will and leadership, there is in fact the way, and our system works.
That's a perfect note to end this particular part of our forum. I just want to thank our three panelists who were really terrific. And now I get to call up our very own Mayor David Dinkins to close the forum.
Well, there's some people here in this audience with whom I've worked over time, and so they know all my material. And so Mark Benoit, you will recognize this early on. Is that, well, that's no, that Johnstown flood fits. It really does fit. You see, in 1889 there was a hi, gendarme. In 1889 there was this flood in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. The dam above the town gave way and waters came down and a lot of people lost their lives. There were those that clung to a wooden railroad trestle and thought that they might be saved, but debris piled up along the trestle. Friction caused the fire and they too perished. Well, a man survived all this, lived to be 105. And he found that in heaven, he went to heaven because he was a good person. He found out that it was the custom in heaven to come forth and tell of a momentous event in your life. And he knew that he would be an instant celebrity in heaven, for after all, he had survived the mighty Johnstown flood. So ultimately his turn came, and he strode down the center aisle toward the lectern, confident that in seconds everyone in heaven would know who he was, for after all, he'd survived the mighty Johnstown flood, this tragedy of immense proportion. Well, as he passed, an angel reached out and touched him on the shoulder and said, "I think you should know that Noah is in the audience." Some of you will get that on your way home. The point is that we have had 8 Noahs here today, and I hope you feel as privileged as I do that they've come forth and given of themselves in this fashion. And I want to conclude this by making this observation. When I was privileged to serve this city as mayor, not infrequently the press would surround me and fire questions. And I'd give what I thought was an appropriate response. And then they would say, "Well, you mean in other words?" And my response was, "No, not in other words, in the words I've just given you." So you will not get a summation from me. There will be no other words. These are the words. Thanks for coming.